Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 135, Year 1. The officials of the Ministry of Kami Affairs bustled to and fro as they prepared the ritual grounds and the temporary buildings. They were carefully erecting the structures which would only be used for a single festival and then torn down, but this would be an important festival. It was the harvest festival, the Niiname-sai, the festival of first fruits. Rice from the regions of Tamba and Harima, specifically chosen through divination, would be offered to His Majesty along with the kami who had blessed the land. But this time, there was more. After all, this was the first harvest festival of a new reign, and they had orders to make it special. The ascension ceremony had been held earlier in the year, but in some ways that was just a prelude. There had been various rituals and ceremonies, auspicious omens throughout the year, emphasizing that this year was special. Even foreign lands were sending envoys to congratulate him on the event. But this wasn't for them. This was the sovereign taking part for the first time in one of the most important ceremonies of the year. After all, the Feast of First Fruits was the culmination of all that the kami had done, and it emphasized the sovereign's role as both a descendant of heaven and as the preeminent intercessor with the divine spirits of the land. And so they knew that everything had to be bigger, with even more pomp and circumstance than normal. This wouldn't just be about new rice, this would be a grand ceremony, one that only happened once in a generation, and yet which would echo through the centuries. As the annual harvest festival, it was an ancient tradition. But as something new, as the Daimyo-sai, well, that was something else altogether. And it would have to be perfect. All right, well, welcome back. And last episode, we talked about the Kiyomihara Palace and a little bit about what it was like in the court of Owama, aka Tenmu Tenno. After defeating the Omi court supporting his nephew, Otomo, in 672, Owama had taken control of the government. He moved back to Asuka and into the refurbished Okamoto Palace, building a southern exclave known to us today as the Ebinoko Enclosure, which held one large building, which may have been a residence or a ceremonial structure, possibly the very first Daigokuden, or ceremonial hall. Owama's court built on the ideas that his brother Nakano Oe, aka Tenji Tenno, had put forth since the Taika era. This was a continuation of the form of government known as the Ritsuryo system, or Ritsuryose, literally a government of laws and punishments, and Owama had taken the reins. He seemed to have taken a much more direct approach to governance compared to some of his predecessors. For instance, the role of the ministerial families was much reduced, with Owama or various princes, actual or invented relatives of the throne, taking a much more prominent role. He also expanded access to the central government to those outside of the home provinces. After all, it was the traditional ministerial families, the Soga, the Nakatomi, and even the Kosei, who had been part of the Omi government that he had just defeated. Meanwhile, much of his military support had come from the eastern provinces, though with prominent indications of support from places like Kibi and Tsukushi as well. This episode, we are going to get back to the events documented in the Chronicles, looking just at the first year of Owama's reign. Well, technically it was the second year, with 672 being the first, but this is the first year in which he formally sat on the throne. There's plenty going on this year to fill a whole episode. It was the year of Owama's formal ascension, and there were numerous festivals, ceremonies, and other activities that seemed to be directly related to a fresh new start. We'll also look at the custom of handing out posthumous ranks, particularly to those who supported Owama during the Jinshin no-ran, the Jinshin War, and how that relates to the various ranks and titles used in Owama's court. We have envoys from 3 different countries, Tamna, Shilla, and Goryeo, and their interactions with the Dazaifu and Tsukushi, as well as the throne itself. Finally, we have the first Daimyo-sai, one of the most important ceremonies in any reign. And so, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the year 673 started with a banquet for various princes and ministers, and on the 27th day of the second month, Oama formally assumed the throne at what would become known as the Kiyomihara Palace. Uno, his consort, who had traveled with him through the mountains from Yoshino to Ise, was made his queen, and their son, the royal prince Kusakabe, was named crown prince. 2 days later, they held a ceremony to convey cap ranks on those deemed worthy. We are told that on the 17th day of the following month, word came from the governor of Bingo, the far western side of ancient Kibi, today the eastern part of modern Hiroshima. The report said they had caught a white pheasant in Kameshi and sent it as tribute. White or albino animals were seen as particularly auspicious signs, and no doubt it was taken as an omen of good fortune for the rain. In response, the forced labor from Bingo, which households were required to supply to the state, was remitted. There was also a general amnesty granted throughout the land. That same month, we are also told that scribes were brought into Kawara-dera to copy the Isaiko, aka the Tripitaka, or the entirety of the Buddhist canon, or at least as it existed in the islands at that time. That would include hundreds of scrolls. This clearly seems to be an act of Buddhist merit-making. By copying out the scrolls, you make merit, which translates to good karma, not just for those copying, but for the nation as a whole. That would be another auspicious start to the reign, and we see frequently that rulers would fund sutra copying or sutra recitations, as well as temples, statues, bells, and other such things to earn Buddhist merit. As the ruler, the merit didn't just accrue to you, but to the entire state, presumably bringing good fortune and helping to avert disaster. However, it wasn't just the law of the Buddha that Oama was appealing to. In the following entry, on the 14th day of the 4th month, we are told that Princess Oki was preparing herself at the Saigu, or Abstinence Palace, in Hatsuse, also known as Hasse today, east of modern Sakurai, along the Yonabari River on the road to Uda. Oki was the sister of Prince Otsu. Her mother was Ota, the queen's elder sister, making her a grandchild of Nakano-Oe himself, as well as the daughter of Oama. Princess Oki's time at the Abstinence Palace was so that she could purify herself. This was all to get her ready to head to Ise to approach none other than the sun goddess herself, Amaterasu Okami. With all of these events, we see the full panoply of ritual and ceremony on display. The formal legal ceremonies of ascension and granting of rank, the declaration of auspicious omens for the reign. There is the making of Buddhist merit, but also the worship of kami on the archipelago. This is not an either-or situation. We are seeing in the first half of this first year the fusion of all these different elements into something that may not even be all that sensational to those of us today. After all, anyone who goes to Japan is likely well accustomed to the way that both Buddhist and Shinto institutions can both play a large part in people's lives. While some people may be more drawn to one or the other, for the most they are complementary. But that isn't how it had to be. For a time, it was possible that Buddhism would displace local kami worship altogether. This was the core of the backlash that we saw from groups like the Nakatomi, whose role in kami-focused ceremonies was threatened by this new religion. Indeed, for a while now, it seems like mention of the kami has taken a back seat to Buddhist temples and ceremonies in the Chronicles. Likewise, as a foreign religion, Buddhism could have also fallen out of favor. It was not foreordained that it would come to have a permanent place on the archipelago. This tension between local kami worship, later called Shinto, the way of the kami, and Buddhist teachings would vary throughout Japanese history, with one sometimes seen as more prestigious or more natural than the other. Neither one would fully eclipse the other. One could say that this was in part due to the role that Amaterasu and kami worship played in the court ceremonies. However, even there, indigenous practices were not necessarily safe. The court could have just as easily imported Confucian rituals and replaced the spiritual connection between the sovereign and the kami with the continental-style mandate of heaven. Thus, the choices that were being made at this time would have huge implications for the Japanese state for centuries to come. I should note that it is unlikely that this spontaneously arose amongst the upper classes and the leadership. I doubt this was just Owama's strategy to give himself multiple levers of power, though I'm not saying he wasn't thinking about that either. But the only way that these levers existed was through their continued life in the culture and the people of the time. If the people didn't believe in Buddhist merit or that the kami influenced their lives, then neither would have given them much sway. It was the fact that these were a part of the cultural imaginary of the state and how people imagined themselves and their surroundings that they were effective tools for Owama and his government. And so it seems that Owama's first year is off to a smashing success. By the 5th month, he is already issuing edicts specifically on the structure of the state, which we discussed some last episode. But the high could not be maintained indefinitely, and on the 29th day of the 5th month, we have what we might consider our first negative entry, when Sakamoto no Takara no Omi passed away. You may remember Takara, but I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. He was the commander in the Nara Basin under General Ofuke, who took 300 troops to Tatsuta. From there, Takara advanced to the Hiraishi Plain and up to the top of Mount Takayasu to confront the Omi forces that had taken the castle. They fled, and Takara and his men overnighted at the castle, and the next day they tried to intercept Omi troops advancing from the Kawachi Plain, but they were forced to fall back to a defensive position. We covered all that in episode 131 with the rest of the campaign in the Nara Basin. Now, Takara's death is the first of many entries. I count roughly 21 through this and the following reign, which for the most part are all similarly worded. Sakamoto no Takara no Omi of Upper Daikin rank died. He was posthumously granted the rank of Shoshi for service in the year of Mizunoe Saru, aka Jinshin. So we are told the individual, their rank at the time of their death, and then a note about a posthumous grant of rank. Upper Daikin was already about the 7th rank from the top in the system of 664, and Shoshi would be the 6th rank, and one of the ministerial ranks. This is out of 26 ranks total at this time. Kin itself was the 4th of about 7 categories, and the last category that was split into 6 sub-ranks with greater and lesser, for instance, Daikin and Shokin, each of which was further divided into upper, middle, and lower ranks. So you had upper Daikin, middle Daikin, lower Daikin, upper Shokin, middle Shokin, lower Shokin, etc. There's a lot to go into. In fact, a little too much for this episode, so for more on the ranks in use at the start of the reign, please check out our blog post for this episode. Now, the giving of posthumous rank is mostly just an honorific. After all, the individual is now deceased, so it isn't as if they would have been drawing more of a stipend, though their new ranks may have influenced things like their funerary rites and things like that. As I said, on a quick scan of the text, I counted 21 of these entries. There may be a few more with slightly different phrasing or circumstances. Some of them were quite notable in the record, while others may have only had a mention here or there. That they are mentioned, though, likely speaks to the importance of that connection to such a momentous year. The Nihon Shoki is thought to have been started around the time of Owama or his successor, along with the Kojiki, and so it would have been important to people of the time to remind everyone that their ancestors had been the ones who helped with that momentous event. It really isn't much different from those who proudly trace their lineage back to the heroes of, say, the American Revolution, though it likely held even more sway being closer to the actual events in question. Now, after the death of Sakamoto no Takara, we get another death announcement. This is of someone that Aston translates as Satek Seomyong of Baekje, of lower Daikin rank. We aren't given much else about him, but we are told that Owama was shocked. He granted Shomong the posthumous rank of Outer Shoshi, per Aston's translation, and he also posthumously named him as Prime Minister, or Daesapyeong, of Baekje. Now, there are a few clues about who this might be, but very little to go on overall. He is mentioned in 671 during the reign of Nakano-Oe when he received the rank of upper daikin along with minister, or sapyong, Yojasin. It is also said in the interlinear text that he was the vice minister of the Ministry of Judgment, the Hokan no Taifu. The Ministry of Judgment, the Hokan, or perhaps Nori no Tsukasa, is thought to have been the progenitor of the later Shikibu, the Ministry of Ceremony. One of the major roles it played was in the selection of candidates for rank, position, and promotion. We are also told that in the year 660, in the reign of Takarahime, one of the nobles captured in the Tang invasion of Baekje was Daesepyeong Satek, so perhaps this Seomyeong was a descendant or relative of the previous prime minister, who fled to Yamato with other refugees. We also have another record from 671 of a Satek Sonjeong and his companions accompanying the Tang envoy Guo Yatsun, so it would seem that the Satek family was certainly notable. The name Satek shows up once more, though Austin then translates it as Sataku, like a monk or scholar's name. Sataku would be the Japanese onyomi pronunciation of the same characters, so perhaps another relative? What we can take away from all this is that the Baekje refugee community is still a thing in Yamato. This Satek Somyeong has court rank, upper daikin rank, just like Sakamoto in the previous entry. And we know he had an official position at court, not just the Baekje court in exile. We'll see more on this as the community is further integrated into the rest of society, such that there would eventually no longer really be a Baekje community, but families would continue to trace their lineages back to Baekje families, often with some pride. The other odd thing here is the character outer or outside before shoshi. Aston translates it as part of the rank, and we see it later show up a total of 4 times in some variation of outer lesser X rank. Mostly it is, as here, outer lesser purple, outer shoshi. Later, we would see a distinction of outer and inner ranks, which this may be an early version of. Depending on one's family lineage, it would denote whether one received an outer or an inner rank. And so it may be that since Satek Seomyeong was from the Baekje community, it was more appropriate for him to have an outside rank. Outer rank would also be given to Murakuni no Muraji no Woyori, the general who had led the campaign to Omi taking the Seta Bridge. He was also posthumously given the rank of outer shoshi upon his death in 676. Murakuni no Oyori was the only person of that surname mentioned around this time, so perhaps he wasn't from one of the core families of the Yamato court, despite the service he had rendered. We also have at least one other noble of Baekje who is likewise granted an outer rank. On the other side, there are those like Omiwa no Makamuto no Kobito no Kimi, who was posthumously granted the rank of inner shoshi. Here I would note that Omiwa certainly seems to suggest an origin in the Nara Basin, in the heartland of Yamato. The terms inner and outer are only used on occasion, and not consistently in all cases. So this could just be because of the records that the scribes were working off at the time. It's hard to say exactly. All of these entries about posthumous ranks being granted tend to refer to cap ranks, those applying to members of the various uji, the clans that had been created to help organize the pre-Ritsuryo state. The uji and their members played important roles in the court and the nation, both as ministers and lower functionaries. But I also want to mention another important component of Owama's court, the members of the princely class, many of whom also actively contributed to the functioning of the state. Among this class are those that Aston refers to as princes of the blood, or shinno. These include the royal princes, sons of Owama, who were in line for the throne, but also any of his brothers and sisters. Then there were the miko, like Prince Kurikuma, who had been the viceroy in Tsukushi, denying troops to the Omi court. These princes claim some lineal descent from a sovereign, but they were not directly related to the reigning sovereign. In fact, it isn't clear today if they were even indirectly related to the reigning sovereign, other than through the fact that the elites of the archipelago had likely been forming marriage alliances with one another for centuries, so who knows? And maybe they made their claims back to another heavenly descendant like Nigi Hayai. Either way, they were the ones with claims, legitimate or otherwise, to royal blood. Notably, the princes did not belong to any of the Uji, and they didn't have kabane either. No Omi, Muraji, Atae, etc. They did, at least from this reign forward, have rank, but it was separate and different from the rank of the Uji members. Members of the various Uji were referred to with cap rank, but the princely ranks were just numbered. In the Nihon Shoki, we see mention of the princes of the 2nd through 5th ranks. Presumably, there was also a first rank, though whether it was called first rank, I'm not entirely sure. It's not entirely clear when this princely rank system was first put into place, but it was probably as they were moving all of the land, thus the taxes to the state. Therefore, the court would have needed to know what kind of stipend each prince was to receive. A stipend based on their rank. These ranks, as with later numbered ranks, appear to have been given in ascending order, like medals in a tournament. So, first rank at the top, then second rank, third rank, etc., with fifth rank being the lowest of the princely ranks. Many of these princes also held formal positions in the government. We saw this in Nakano-Oe's reign, with Prince Kurikuma taking the viceroyship of Tsukushi, but during Oama's reign we see it even more. Beneath the princes were the various ministers and public functionaries, officers of the court from the lowest page to the highest minister. They were members, as I said, of the elite noble families for the most part, or at least they claimed descent from the elite families of the continent. Either way, they were part of what we would no doubt call the nobility. Their cap rank system, mentioned earlier, was separate from that used by the princes. And then, pretty much at the bottom, supporting this structure, were the common people. Like the princes, they did not necessarily have a surname, and they didn't really figure into the formal rank system. They certainly weren't considered members of the titled class, and often don't even show up in the record. And yet we should not forget that they were no doubt the most numerous and diverse group for the majority of Japanese history. Our sources, however, have a much more narrow focus. There is one more class of people to mention here, and that is the evolving priestly class. Those who took Buddhist orders and became Buddhist monks were technically placed outside of the social system, though that did not entirely negate their connections to the outside world. We see, for example, how Oama, even in taking orders, still had servants and others to wait on him. However, they were at least theoretically outside of the social hierarchy and could achieve standing within the Buddhist community through their studies of Buddhist scripture. They had their own hierarchy, which was tied into the state through particular Buddhist officers appointed by the government, but otherwise the various temples seem to have been largely in charge of their own affairs. But anyway, let's get back to the Chronicles. Following closely on the heels of Satek Shomong's passing, 2 days later, we have another entry, and this one much more neutral. We are told that Tamna, aka the Kingdom of Jeju Island off the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, sent princes Kumae, Tora, Uma, and others with tribute. So now we're getting back into the diplomatic swing of things. There had been one previous embassy, that of Kim Upshil of Shilla, who had arrived just towards the end of the Jinshin War, but they were merely entertained in Tsukushi and sent back, probably because Oama's court was still cleaning house. Tamna, Shilla, and Goguryeo, usually accompanied by Shilla escorts, would be the main visitors to Yamato for quite a time. At this point, Shilla was pretty busy trying to get the Tang forces to leave the peninsula, and this was partly assisted by the various uprisings in the captured territories of Goguryeo and Baekje, though primarily up in Goguryeo. There were various attempts to restore the kingdom, and it isn't clear, but I suspect that Goguryeo envoys we do eventually see were operating largely as a vassal state under Shilla's control. Tamna, on the other hand, seems to have been largely outside of the conflict, at least from what we can see in the records, and it likely was pretty out of the way of the majority of any fighting. They also seem to have had different relationships with Yamato based on some of the interactions. And it's really curious to me that the names of the people from Tamna seem like they could have come from Yamato. Perhaps that's related in some ways to theories that Tamna was one of the last holdouts of the continental Proto-Japonic language prior to the ancestor of modern Korean gaining ascendancy. Or it could just be an accident of how things got copied down in Sinitic characters and then translated back out. It's really hard to say. The Tamna mission arrived on the 8th day of the 6th intercalary month of 673. A Shilla embassy arrived 7 days later, but rather than tribute, their mission was twofold. 2 ambassadors to offer congratulations to Oama, and 2 to offer condolences on the late sovereign. Though whether that means Nakano Oe or Otomo, not exactly clear. All of these arrived and would have been hosted initially in Tsukushi, probably at modern Fukuoka. The Shilla envoys were accompanied by escorts who were briefly entertained and offered presents by the Dazaifu, the Yamato government extension on Kyushu, and then sent home. From then on, the envoys would be at the mercy of Yamato and their ships. Now, about a month and a half later, on the 20th day of the 8th month, Goguryeo envoys also showed up with tribute, accompanied by Shilla escorts. 5 days later, word arrived back from the court in Asuka. The Shilla envoys, who had come to offer congratulations to the sovereign on his ascension, were to be sent onwards. Those who had just come with tribute, however, you could leave it with the viceroy in Tsukushi. They specifically made this point to the Tamna envoys, whom they then suggested should head back soon as the weather was about to turn, and they wouldn't want to be stuck there when the monsoon season came. Now, the Tamna cohort weren't just kicked out. The court did grant their king cap rank, and the envoys were given upper daiyotsu, which Yamato equated to the rank of a minister in Tamna. The Shilla envoys, about 27 in total, made their way to Naniwa. It took them quite a while. They arrived in Naniwa on the 28th day of the 9th month, about 30 days after they had left. Their arrival was met with entertainments, musical performances, and presents that were given to the envoys. This was all part of the standard diplomatic song and dance, quite literally in this case. And we aren't given details on everything. Presumably, the envoys offered their congratulations, which likely included some presents from Shilla as well as a congratulatory message. We aren't given exact details, but a little more than a month later, on the first day of the 11th month, envoy Gim Sung-won took his leave. Meanwhile, the Goguryeo envoys, who, like Tamna, had arrived merely with tribute, were still in Tsukushi. On the 21st day of the 11th month, just over 2 months after they arrived, we are told that they were entertained at the Ogori in Tsukushi and were given presents based on their rank. The Ogori, by the way, the big district, appears to mirror a similar area in Naniwa that was likewise known for hosting diplomatic envoys back in the day. With the diplomatic niceties over, there was one more thing to do in this first year of the new reign. The Thanksgiving ritual, always held at the beginning of a new reign, the Daijō-sai, or O-Name-matsuri. This is a harvest ritual where the newly enthroned sovereign offers new rice to the kami and then eats some himself. At least in the modern version, he gives thanks and praise to the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami, as well as to the Amatsu Kami and Kunitsu Kami, the kami of heaven and earth. The Daijō-sai shares a lot in common with another important annual festival, the Niiname-sai, or the Feast of First Fruits. This is the traditional harvest festival usually held in November. The Daijō-sai follows much the same form as the Niiname-sai, and as such, in years where there is a new sovereign, and thus the Daijō-sai is held, well, the Niiname-sai is not, since it would really be duplicative. Now, many of the rituals of the Daijō-sai are private affairs and not open to the public. There are various theories about what happens, but only those who are part of the ritual know for sure, and they are sworn to secrecy. Though we do have some descriptions of the general form of what happens. Now, the first instance of the Daijō-sai in the Chronicles is during the reign of Shiraga Takahiko Kuniyoshiwaka Yamato Neko, aka Seine Tenno in the 5th century. but we should probably take that with a huge grain of salt. Remember, one of the purposes behind the Chronicles was just to explain how everything came to be, and saying, "Oh, we just made it up," probably wasn't really going to fly. I've seen some sources suggest that the Daijosai can be attributed to the first reign of Oama's mother, Takarahime, aka Kogyoku Tenno. The term used in her reign, though, is Niiname, which would seem to refer to the annual Niiname-sai, though she is the first in the Chronicles that seems to celebrate it in the first year of her reign, sharing the rice with the crown prince and the ministers. It's likely that this ritual is much older in origin. After all, giving the first fruits of the harvest to the kami to thank them for their assistance seems like the core of harvest festivals around the world. We see it mentioned as the Niiname-sai and much of the rest of the Nihon Shoki, even back to the Age of the Gods, when it played an important part in the stories of Amaterasu and Susanoo. It is in Oama's reign, though, that it seems to first take on its character as a true ritual of the state, as part of, in particular, the ascension ceremonies. We see that the Nakatomi and the Imbe were involved. Together, these two families oversaw much of the court ritual having to do with kami worship. We also know that the officials of the Jingi-kan, the Ministry of Kami Affairs, were also present, as they were all given presents for attending on the sovereign during the festival. The Jingi-kan would come to be dominated by the Nakatomi and the Imbe, who held hereditary offices within the ministry. We also see that the district governors of Harima and Tamba, which were both in the areas of modern Hyogo Prefecture, as well as various laborers under them, were all recognized with presents as well. We can assume that this was because they were the ones that provided the rice and other offerings used in the festival. In addition to the presents they received, the two governors were each given an extra grade of cap rank. Another Daijosai would be carried out in the first year of Oama's successor, and from there on it seems to have become one of, if not the major festival of a reign. It marks in many ways the end of the first year of ceremonies for the first year of a reign, and even in other years the Niiname-sai is often one of the preeminent festivals. The Daijosai may have been the climax of the year in many ways, but the year was not quite over yet. We have two more entries, and both are related to Buddhism. First, on the 17th day of the 12th month, just 12 days after the Daijosai, Prince Mino and Kino-omi no Katamaro were appointed commissioners for the erection of the Great Temple of Takechi, aka the Omiya no Odera, also known as Daikan Daiji. The Daikan Daiji was a massive temple complex. It is thought that it was originally a relocation of Kudara Odera, and we have remains at the foot of Kaguyama, Mount Kagu, in the Asuka region of modern Kashihara City. Many of the ruins, however, seem to date to a slightly later period, suggesting that the main temple buildings were rebuilt at some point after Oama's reign. Still, it is quite likely that he had people start the initial work. Now, in setting up the temple, of course, it needed a head priest, and so Oama called upon a priest named Fukurin and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Literally. Fukurin tried to object to being posted as the head priest. He said he was too old to be in charge of a temple. Don't get him started now. Oama wasn't having any of it, though. He had made up his mind, and Fukurin was in no position to refuse him. By the way, a quick note on the two commissioners here. First off, I would note that Prince Mino here isn't mentioned as having princely rank. Instead, he is mentioned with the ministerial rank of shoshi, cap rank, basically. Kino Katamaro, on the other hand, is lower shokin, several grades below. Once again, a bit of confusion in the ranks, as it were. Possibly because, well, they were still figuring some of this stuff out. Now, the final entry for the year 673 occurred 10 days after the erection of the Great Temple, and it was a fairly straightforward entry. The Buddhist priest, Gijo, was made Shosoju, or Junior Soju. Junior Soju was one of the government-appointed positions of priests charged with overseeing the activities of the priests and temples and holding them to account as necessary. Originally, there was the Sojo and the Soju, but They were later broken up into different positions, likely due to the proliferation of Buddhism throughout the archipelago. There doesn't seem to be much on Gijo before this point, but we know that he would later go on to live a pretty full life, passing away over 30 years later in 706 CE. He would outlive Oama and his successor. And with that, we come to the end of the first year, 673. Not planning to go year by year through this entire reign. In fact, we have already touched on a lot of the various recurring entries, but I do think it was worth it to see how the Chronicles treat this first year for a reign that would have been considered pretty important to the people of the time. Next episode, we'll continue going through the reign of Oama, aka Tenmu Tenno. There is a lot going on, which, as I've said, will influence the nation for centuries, even up until the modern day. Until then, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo. Or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode, like that explanation of ranks. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page, or you can email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.